Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. I'm Martin Panek. I'm the director of a Prague, Czech Republic-based think tank called the Liberal Institute, as in classically liberal. We're libertarians, and it's my greatest pleasure today to welcome here Messrs. Bryan Caplan and Weinersmith, the authors of this wonderful book, Open Borders. We're in the middle of our translation process. We're translating this book into Czech, and we'll have a discussion about the book today. We'll start with very short introductions from the two authors, from Mr. Caplan and Mr. Weinersmith. I hope all technical issues are sorted by now. I hope we have audio. And so I'll just mention one more thing. We're having a crowdfunding campaign for this book. I'll send the link to the event and to the chat here. We also established a site for English speakers. So if you feel like contributing, I'll be sharing that link during the webinar as well. Thank you all for joining us. If you want to join us on Google Meet and join the discussion, I'll post the link here. It should also be broadcast in the video from time to time. And I hope we'll have a fun evening. So it's evening here in Prague, and the pubs are closed. So instead of going to the pub, we're having webinars. I know it's early afternoon or noon in the US in case some folks are watching us. And without further ado, I'll give the floor to, I guess, Mr. Caplan.
All right, thank you very much, Martin. And I'm honored that the book is going to be translated into Czech. So you've got a new name for your country, right? So you're now Czechia? Is that right?
Yeah, you could call it that.
Okay. All right. Hello, Czechia. So, speaking in Eastern Europe, the easiest way, I think, to get the point of this book across is this. During the era of Soviet domination, everyone knew that the Eastern Bloc had to keep up very strict borders because otherwise people would leave the country. Why? Because things were so terrible under Soviet domination and so much better elsewhere. And people know, look, if people are free to move, they will. Right? So if the border with the West had been opened, then the era of Soviet rule would have ended much sooner, because really the communist dictatorships would have just been ruling over empty land and realized, wow, this land is almost worthless without the people that actually inhabit it. So that is a lot of the motivation for open borders, and realizing that there are enormous gains if people can leave countries where things are not good and go to places where they are good. Of course, this is true for political oppression. What would North Korea have? What would be left in North Korea if they could just move legally to South Korea? There'd be a few communists maybe going and running some mines left. There'd be again, the country would just be nothing by the end, because people wouldn't want to live there because things are bad if they were free to move, right? And then, of course, there are many countries where the political oppression is not anywhere close to what it was during the Soviet domination era, or during the era of the Iron Curtain, but where nevertheless conditions are very poor, economic policy is poor, and therefore people's labor is very unproductive in their country of birth, much more productive in someplace else. And Open Borders is really all about embracing this opportunity and saying, look, it's really hard to fix a country, but it's not at all hard to give people a way to escape a country that isn't working well. The problem is we have these very strict laws that are designed to greatly limit migration. And it seems, at least on the surface, that it would be not only morally good, but a great practical improvement if people could just move areas that are not working well, go to places where they are working. And then what I do in Open Borders, with the wonderful help of Zach as the illustrator and also contributing humorist, is to just try to bring these opportunities to life, to take research that hardly anyone would ever read because it's not fun, and to make it as engaging as it really is, to show these papers that you might think of as just being an obscure academic journal are actually each of them a brick in an edifice. and that edifice is one showing an enormous and fantastic opportunity for mankind we are passing up. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I see we are now joined by former Vice President of the Czech National Bank. So very, very interesting webinar I hope is ahead of us. I'll give the floor to Mr. Weinersmith.
I don't have a lot to add. Bryan is pretty comprehensive. I'm more fit to talk about the utility of comics for conveying ideas like this. But yeah, I have nothing clever to add.
Do it.
Well, you can tell us from your perspective how you think, for example, how the comic format better communicates the issue, because I really love the book. I think it's ingenious, and I think that especially in the comic format, it's just great. And the thing that I find really interesting about the book is that it's very easy to read, but at the same time it's very rigorous, because you have all those references to all those panels there, and I think it's a great feat that you guys achieved. So if you want to comment on that.
Sure. Yeah, it's funny. One of the funny experiences we had after releasing this book is people kept giving us credit for inventing the genre of the nonfiction novel, which of course has been around almost since the beginning of comics, and I mean it's become a more popular genre recently, but yeah, I think it's a really good format because you're doing the equivalent of something like a really, really tight, really good 2 to 3 hour lecture. I think there's like this weird human thing. If I were to write down like dialogues between people might read it, but somehow having it come out of a human being in a setting just makes people want to keep reading. And I'm sure there's some good theory on why that is, but it does seem to be the case. And then what's nice, one thing that is unusual about this book as a nonfiction graphic novel is, as you say, it has the works referenced at the end in detail, which I think the cartoon history of comics or cartoon history books do that, but most don't. So I think that's really cool too. Like as a nerd, it means if you disagree or you agree strongly or whatever it is, you can follow up and make a better decision. So yeah, the format brings a lot to the table.
Right. I would also say that Europeans are much more used to the idea of serious comics, literary comics. They're less prevalent in the U.S. And you might actually notice that we tried to borrow some of the vocabulary and style from classic European comics. So in particular, I'm guessing that a lot of you read Tintin when you were kids.
Yeah.
So, and if you look carefully at the colors of our book and compare them to a Tintin comic, you will see that there's almost a perfect match, which was deliberate. So a lot of this is an homage to the style of Tintin and is trying to get the subliminal associations of Tintin. Because remember, it's all about a Belgian teenage journalist who travels the world and has adventures. And along the way, he sees how beautiful the world is and how much there is to find out and discover. So that's a lot of what we were going for in this book.
I see. Were you always an avid comic book reader, Mr. Caplan?
No, actually. So although my family was not poor, I was poor as a child because my family did not believe in giving kids any money, and therefore so I had almost no money to buy comics. So I never bought them. I don't think I could have afforded one comic book a week actually as a kid. And then our library just had a few badly mangled random issues of different comics. So it was really only when I was in college that a friend of mine gave me Watchmen as a birthday present that I started. And then it's really only after I became a professor and I had a lot more money to spend that I started buying them, because again, libraries usually have very little in their comics collections. Now it's a bit better, but anyway. So now, I mean, I've got my personal collection is now about as good as my university libraries, which is sort of a common. So mine is good. It would be good. It would be about average for a university library. University libraries have a lot more than they used to, but I have put a lot into it, but mostly just in the while since becoming a professor, actually. So, and then I put a lot of time into reading the classics. And again, a lot of what was going on with this book was the idea of, so after reading a few hundred, am I now qualified to write one? And the idea that just reading makes you qualified to write is not true.
Yeah.
I watched a lot of painting, so now I can paint. But fortunately, Zach held my hand during the whole process, and I had many visual ideas that he said, "Bryan, this just won't work. This panel is very small. You can't show a crowd in a small panel." Oh, okay. So, that was so great about working with Zach was that he taught me how to actually do this, and he trained me. And so he was just such a wonderful collaborator to get an education in the process of producing the product.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I could ask you, Mr. Weinersmith, the same question. Were you always a comic book or comic reader, or how did you come up with it?
No, I feel bad admitting it. I think so. See, it's weird. These days there are like comics institutes that people like start training to be cartoonists, and it's really strange. But I think a lot of people in my generation of cartoonists started in comics by accident because like we could draw a little, and it seemed like a way you could use your skills. And then for me, it was something I could make a living at that allowed me to kind of stay at home. So I sort of fell into it. I read comics a decent amount, but I don't read comics more than say just any other type of book. In fact, these days I read fewer comics. Although I read a lot with my daughter now. She's very into comics.
So Zach, they said that you were reading comics, or you were drawing rather, from the earliest age. Is there a time when you can remember when you didn't draw?
Oh yeah. I certainly, I'm like a compulsive drawer. I like if I'm not doing it now. I'll show you my hands, but usually when I'm in a meeting, I sit around drawing things. So yeah, that's absolutely true. But as perhaps the art of comics is pretty substantially different from like drawing skill. It's more about picking. I would say it's a lot more like directing a movie or something than drawing. I am not nearly. I'm not even top 50% artist in my generation of artists. Maybe not even top 3/4. But I can do comics okay.
Disagree.
Zach
is awesome. Don't listen to him. He's great.
And how did you guys meet, or how did you come up with this joint project?
Well, so I guess it does start with me. I had this idea for wanting to do a nonfiction graphic novel. I've been inspired by some others that I read, like Larry Gonick's Cartoon History of the Universe. And so I started storyboarding it using some defunct comic software. And then I just started making up a list of my dream candidates to illustrate the book. Zach was my number one choice in the universe, but I didn't know him. So what I did was kind of thing I advise almost anyone to do, which is, just be a very polite stalker, a well-mannered stalker, a genteel, civilized stalker. So what I did was I first friended him on Facebook, and when he accepted, I then waited a few weeks, and deliberately so, strategic. I wanted to write him back immediately. Just give him a few weeks, let him just become a normal person. And then after a few weeks, that's when I contacted him and said that I had an idea for a project and was wondering whether he'd be willing to talk to me about it. And so Zach was kind enough to give me the time of day, and I did pitch it. And then soon afterwards, he wrote back and just said, "Sorry, I just can't do it. I'm too busy. I got a kid coming." And then I was like, "Oh well, you can't expect to get your first person." And then soon afterwards, he wrote back to me and said he changed his mind and that he did want to do it. And I'm like, yeah, awesome. All right. And Zach has the backstory for how he changed his mind, so I'll let him share that with you.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of funny. Like I think Bryan was being too clever about this because most of what I do all day long is I read books, and so I had read all of Bryan's books. He's just someone I enjoy, and I especially enjoy contrarians who make strong arguments, which is like what Bryan does all day. And so I was already familiar with it. I actually went when Bryan had said, he sent me an email that was like, "Can we get on the phone?" I actually told my wife, I'm like scared that Bryan Caplan's going to ask me to do a project with him, because I'm gonna want to say yes, but there's we have a baby. I forget the exact timeline, but I think we were having a baby literally within weeks. And it's kind of a longer story, but essentially, I went to my wife and I told her it sounds like an amazing project, and also it's pretty well paid work. And then I have this visual of my wife sitting on a couch pregnant being like, "Do we really want to turn down money right now?" And me being like, "That sounds like a yes." So that's when I called back, or I guess I emailed back. But yeah, no, it's actually a little bit better than that because I actually read. There's an essay by Bryan, and I always forget the title, but it's I think
why should we restrict immigration? Question mark.
Why should we restrict? Yeah, so if you read that paper, which I think is from what 2010,
2012.
So, yeah, so that paper, you read it, it reads like a kind of precursor to this book. A lot of the same arguments are in it, but they're more fleshed out in the comic. And I'd actually read that. I don't know how many people read it because it's like a 30-page detailed essay. It's probably a certain category of scholar. But I read it, and it was for me very formative of my views on immigration because it was very very well argued. I didn't know how much I'd thought about it previously. So when Bryan said he would get in touch, I was worried it was going to be that project that I would have to say no to. So fortunately, it all worked out.
I had a question. Were you always for open borders, or did some event or some article persuade you when you were older or very young? I guess you just answered this question, maybe, Mr. Caplan.
Yeah. So for me, I was just a normal American until I was about 17 or so. So I wrote an essay on immigration policy for a bioethics segment of my 10th grade biology class, where it was just expressed very ordinary views of, immigration is pretty good, but they need to assimilate more. And that was the gist of it. It was only when I started studying economics that I really started thinking about this more. So there was a libertarian element of why should people be free to migrate. And then there was also the economist element of if free trade in goods is so wonderful, what about free trade in people? But it's actually only in the early 2000s that I started reading empirical research on this and realizing this isn't just one issue out of many. This is actually the single most important issue in the world because actually for goods, trade is fairly close to free already. But for labor, it is so far from free. And you can see this in the enormous changes in income that people have when they move from one country to another. Even when you go from Czechia to, say, the UK, there's a very large increase in earnings, and that is that has at least been like a free migration zone for a while. This may be under Brexit; it won't be anymore. But then, when you think about very hard national borders, that's where you see enormous disparities. Again, between, say, Haiti and Florida. And that's what researchers started doing the math on and saying, wow, it looks like this is the greatest missed policy opportunity on earth, and by a long shot. And that's where I really started getting interested in saying, well, if it's so great, then why aren't we doing it? And why aren't we working on it more? And sort of my usual rule is, anything that I care about, it will, like, before long, I can easily become one of the most prominent spokesmen for a view because the views I care about hardly have any spokesmen. So on the one hand, it's nice to get to quickly rise up to a high level. On the other hand, it's depressing to say this shows there wasn't that much, that much going on before. So, that's basically my story.
Yeah, well, I knew for quite some time that libertarians are the majority of libertarians are for open borders, but I never actually read anything on it. And then I remember reading your article, I think in Cato Unbound. It was called "The Right to Double Explore" or something.
Yeah, so I think you're thinking about the Cato Journal piece. Why should we restrict immigration? I think so.
I think it was very short. You were comparing migration restrictions with army blockade on Haiti.
Oh yes. That's so. Although I think I did in the other one too. Let's see.
Yeah, it was very short, but I thought very persuasive, and that made me think about the topic more and read more on it. And then I spoke to Alex Narasta. He recommended some sources, and that's how I ended up being a proponent of open borders. So I guess we can move to the discussion with whoever has questions. There were some pre-existing questions in the event. I'll try to find them. But in the meantime, if anybody has a question, you can write it in the chat. I'll read it aloud. You can even write it in Czech. I'll do my best to translate it. And but you can speak up and ask.
Well, Martin, if you would allow, hi, my name is Bill. I was recently in Dubai, and I was wondering, Bryan, what your thought is on the system in the Emirates, because it is the complete absence of a welfare state unless you're one of the 15% of the population that has the citizenship. I was sort of wondering what your view is on that particular model.
Yeah, so I would say you could say bad things about the Gulf monarchies all day, but when it comes to their immigration policy, I say it is among the very best in the world. It's not perfect, but here's the main thing. They let people in, and they don't just let you in if you are a petroleum engineer. They let people in to clean houses, to go and do construction. Low-skilled workers can go. Right? So, I mean, I think about the scene in the movie Moneyball where they're asking Brad Pitt about different baseball players, and for each one, he's like, yeah, there's this problem, that problem, but he gets on base. And certainly, Gulf monarchies, they let a lot of people in. So, I think you were saying like 85% of the population in UAE would be foreign-born, something like that. And that's because they are very welcoming. They're willing to let a lot of people in. They are not treated perfectly, but it's much better to let people in and not treat them perfectly than to say you can't come at all. This is one of the great arrogances of the first world, is like, anyone who's here we treat great, but we hardly let anybody in, and especially low-skilled workers. We don't want them. That's a lot of what's going on. Right, and again, you're right that I think a lot of the reason why there's so much support for immigration, or at least why they're so open to immigration in the Gulf monarchies, is because the welfare state is basically limited to citizens. Of course, it also probably has a lot to do with the fact that they are monarchies, and so they aren't going and actually asking the citizens. I suspect that if you went and had a referendum on immigration among only the citizens in the Gulf monarchies, you would see at least a substantial increase in substantial increase in immigration restrictions. So there's that. But what you see is that a lot of the main complaints that people would have about immigration, they just pre-handle it by saying, look, welfare state's only for natives. It's not there for people who come here. But if you want to come here and work, then you're welcome. So again, I know that there have been abuses of foreign workers, and I don't support that. But nevertheless, credit where credit is due. They let a lot of people in, and on average, people do not go there and then say, "Oh, I had no idea it was like it." The people have phones. They call home, and when someone from Dubai calls someone in home in their village in Pakistan, the main reason they're not calling is to say things are terrible here. The main reason they're calling is to say, "Wow, things are so much better here. Could work hard here for 5 years and go home and retire to our village a rich man."
Yeah, and I find that, if I may, I find that very compelling, because when you talk to locals, that's sort of the feedback that you get. What is
the feedback? That it's okay because you have a welfare state, or actually that they're still upset?
No, well, so that they share this view that they have the ability to come from their countries, which is often Southeast Asia or any of the Muslim countries that have less opportunities. And
I see. So you're talking to the migrant workers themselves,
right? If you talk, anyone who works a lot of in service in industry. But as for the human rights situation, there seems to be this social contract I mean, it's sort of like Disneyland in the desert, with very strong rules on how you can act. I mean, you can't have an opinion or be gay or any of that thing. But there seems to be this implication: we built the city out of nowhere, thus we let everyone in, don't ask for anything, you don't have to pay anything, and we have these really strict rules as well. Is that compatible if you build it out of nothing? Is that different to a city that has previously existed and then shifts policy?
Right. So building a city out of nothing. This does take us to this idea of charter cities that people like Paul Romer have been pushing. Yeah, I would say if you actually started with a big plot of private property and then build it out of nothing, then I'd be the first person to stand up for your right to go and run it however you want. However, I don't think any actual countries like that. It's not really true that they build it out of nothing. if anything, so you've got monarchs that went and seized it from the people that did build it early on, and then after that have been trying to maintain their hold on power. So the history of Saudi Arabia, I know a bit better. But yeah, so you've got you have different tribal leaders that have been fighting for control and also trying to take it from the Ottomans for a long time, and then people have described the Saudi dynasty as the ISIS that won. Right, so a group of religious fanatics in the mid-19th century who managed to get control of some key areas, and from there managed to seize control of a very large area and establish one of the great despotisms in the world. So, so Saudi Arabia, I'd be happy to talk all day about how terrible it is, but they let people in. Right, so and I believe in giving credit where credit is due, and saying if someone's doing a bunch of terrible things, but they also allow people to go and get a job and better their lives, say, yeah, well, that's the part of the Saudi system is good. The rest is terrible.
If other people have questions, you can jump in. Otherwise, I'll read out one of the questions that came beforehand. There's a question from Jan, and I think he can jump in and maybe elaborate on it. He's asking about the Fermat cameo in the book. I'm not actually even sure where exactly in the book it is, but can you say something about it? Maybe Jan, can you jump in and ask the question yourself? It seems like the answer is no.
So I think it's Gauss, not Fermat, not Fermat. Isn't that right, Zach?
Yeah,
I think it's Gauss.
Maybe.
Yeah. Right. Zach?
I'm trying to remember where Fermat is in the book, and I don't think he is.
Yeah, so I mean, really, I just wanted to have a mathematician.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Probability.
I thought, yeah, it's Gauss. I have been in agreement.
Yeah, so I mean, so basically, there's this discussion of terrorism, and I just want to introduce the idea of thinking about practical questions numerically, right? Because again, of course, the way that most people think about questions is emotionally. Right? So if there is one horrible story that changes people's minds more than 100 statistics, and so I wanted to go and sort of combine this, the graphic novel technique with to explain the concepts in a more vivid way. So anyway, so Gauss is one of the founders of probability theory, and in probability theory, it's not primarily a way of thinking about poker and roulette. It's a way of thinking about any kind of decision making. Right, so say when you go and think about, say, the like terrorism, how severe of a problem it is, most people just think about, well, can I tell some horrible stories about terrorism, and then you can do it. Of course, terrorism is very amenable to storytelling. But if on the other hand you go and put it aside other problems, you'll see that numerically it's just not a very big problem. It's one that we've mostly overreacted to. So I think in the book I mentioned that on average about 1,000 people are murdered on Earth per day. And yet you never see a news story saying another 1,000 people got murdered today, right? But if there are 20 people that are killed in France for writing an offensive cartoon, that is news all over the world, right? And again, this doesn't mean that we should not care about 20 people being murdered, but to realize, well, something 50 times as bad as this happens on the average day. So when we're thinking about the right response, if you think that something would be an excessive response to the problem of the world murder rate, then also probably an excessive response to terrorism. And it's one where it just helps to go and have an idea about the severity of the problems. You understand what would be a sensible reaction. Of course, I've been beating this drum during COVID as well, and just saying, look, if we think about how much the response to this is draining value out of life, how much it's hurt quality of life, and compare it to the number of lives saved, I just don't see that it could be remotely even worth it. So again, it's a separate issue, but same kind of thinking, right? To say, well, like how many months of regular life is a year of COVID life worth to you? And if you then multiply that out, so you will see that the total amount that we have spent on the response greatly exceeds anything like the high estimates of total life loss from the disease itself.
right. So Jan is messaging me that he still meant something about Fermat,
Yeah.
so I'll let him speak.
Yeah. But thank you for your answer anyway. I just realized that Munter meant my comment and not something else during your answer. No, I was just commenting that I appreciated the little details in the book. And one of them was that in the panel on how some people are afraid that more immigration will mean more expenses, for example, on social programs and teaching. So in the panel on teaching, there is a camera appearance of the last Fermat's theorem. So I wanted to appreciate that, but I didn't have any question about that.
Okay, that was Zach. Yeah, that was Zach. Yeah.
I believe that was me, and I just don't remember it. I have to pull it up and look.
Yeah, so I'd say that, so while I wrote probably 98% of the words, but Zach did about 1 in 4 or 5 of the jokes, and quite likely, since he's a professional humorist and I just play one for my kids, that he actually has the funnier jokes. I would actually be curious. I mean, I know I felt good when Zach didn't just tell me my joke was terrible and we had to cut it. It's like, a professional humorist thinks that my joke is acceptable. That's all I ever wanted out of life, was for a comedian to say, that's not unfunny anyway.
Yes. No, I mean, they are funny, and there's also, I feel like part of the appeal is that the Bryan Caplan sense of humor is a kind of like nice, uplifting sense of humor, which is a nice thing to have in a book like this, which is such a broad topic for people. So I didn't meddle in it too much, but here and there.
That was great. I mean, there were a few jokes that we were told I was just too old and no one else on earth alive would get them anymore.
That's right.
There's actually one in the Chinatown panel that got cut where I actually had a reference to the movie Chinatown from the 70s. Forget it, Jack, it's Chinatown. And then people said, like, no one remembers that joke anymore, or that line. Like, I mean, it's on the list of the 10 most quoted movie lines of all time. You're telling me no one knows it? Yep, that's right. No one knows it. But actually, the joke we put in was funnier in the end, so it all worked out.
Right. There's another question in the chat. Have you come across evidence that remittances that immigrants send home are large enough to offset losses in the home countries? How do you view the loss of talent in the home countries in general? From Martin.
Yeah, so there's been a good amount of work on this. So I would say out of people who study this, there's a very strong consensus that remittances far more than outweigh whatever the harm is. Again, there are many poor countries. Remittances are a large share of GDP, 10, 20, even 30% of GDP for many countries. And again, you really need to think about this. It's a lot like having a father commute for an hour into a city to make more money and then come home, and then he brings that money home to his family. It's one where, on the one hand, you might say, wouldn't it be nice if we had more time with dad? But on the other hand, he's doing it to provide for the family much more effectively than he could if he just found the best job within walking distance of the home. And that's a lot of what's going on. In terms of other kinds of brain drain, there's been a related research on things like, isn't it bad for the health of the sending countries when medical workers go abroad? And there the answer is that, at least in some of the main countries that have been studied, like the Philippines, the very fact that medical workers have a greatly increased opportunity to work in other countries encourages a lot of people in the Philippines to go and get medical training, and then most of them don't leave. So really, this lottery ticket of if you go and if you actually wind up going here, you'll have a better chance of getting out, leads to a large increase in supply of the trained medical workers, which then actually leads to better medical care for the people in the Philippines as well as the remittances. Now, the other thing is that in terms of brain drain, the main reason there's even an issue is right now it is much easier for highly skilled workers to get into rich countries. So again, a lot of what we're pushing in open borders is let's give the same opportunities to most skilled workers. So like I say in the book, if there is any problem with brain drain, it's a problem of regulation. It's not a problem of migration.
Another question from another Martin. It's a rather long one. What do you think about the European context? The book that I haven't read yet is probably more, has the American situation in mind. What about the radicalization of the Muslim communities, the welfare state, the rise in xenophobia in response to migration, and so on? How would you comment on the efforts of the European states, countries to integrate?
Right. So I would say that there's at least the balance of evidence is probably that immigration works a little bit better in the United States, but I say only a little bit better. And since I think that it's awesome, you can be worse than us and still be awesome. In terms of the complaints that people in Europe have about migration, of course, since I'm speaking to the people of Czechia, remember, there's a lot of people in Western Europe who don't want you guys, right? As you might know if you've ever worked there. So you're not actually that popular in a lot of Western Europe, and there's plenty of people that don't want you there. Now my view is that this has been fantastic because there's a lot of talent in Czechia, and you aren't able to use it to the full extent in your own country. You can go and work in, say, London, and you can use your skills to a much greater extent and get paid for that, and you then use that in whatever way you want. There is this one set of just general complaints about migration within the European Union, which if you're in Western Europe, people will be talking about. If you're in Eastern Europe, you might almost forget about it, but it is worth remembering. Many of these arguments against other migrants really apply to you too. And if you don't think they are fair to people from your country, perhaps they're not fair to people from other countries either. In terms of the specific ones, so the general complaint about Muslim radicalization. Again, this is one where I say it's primarily happens in the media. It's one where you go and you find the son of a secular PhD who then joined ISIS, and you put it on the news, and then you try to generalize from that. Say that is not a good way to learn about the world. The way you learn about the world is not by finding the most emotionally affecting, shocking, horrifying story and then repeating it to other people. The way you learn about the world is by not paying any attention to these stories, calming down, and looking at statistics. So here I say that there is good evidence that actually there's been a great secularization of Muslim immigrants to the European Union. So I have a friend who's worked on the UK. So I think he came up with something like, out of people who are born Muslim in the UK, about 30% are apostates by adults, and by the time they're adults, and just say they're not Muslim anymore. So if you have 30% of people just abandoning the religion, there's got to be a much larger percentage that just don't take it all that seriously. And yet you're never going to put them on the news. There's never going to be a guy in the news saying he was raised to be a conservative Muslim. Now he's a very moderate Muslim. That's not a story, but there's but that is happening on a much wider scale than the opposite thing of people being growing up secular and becoming radicalized. So again, in terms of the total problem of terrorism, I say if you really calm down and add up the numbers, it is a modest problem, which doesn't mean do nothing about it, but it does mean don't go and punish an entire religion for the behavior of a small number of criminals. In terms of other problems to the welfare state, this is one where in the United States we make the very same argument. So on U.S. data, the main thing that we see is that at least the fiscal cost of fiscal cost of immigrants to the U.S. Seems to be actually a net positive. There's a bit more debate about low-skilled migrants. But even there, it's not nearly, at minimum, it's not nearly the burden that people imagine because, again, these are numbers. It's not something where you can emote on it and get an answer. You've got to calm down and really work through the math, and the math is actually very complicated. So most countries in Europe do have bigger welfare states, so it's likely that immigrants will be less positive fiscally or even a burden. Although there, again, I would say, look, if that's the problem, then there are so many better ways of dealing with it. One, of course, is to say that we are limiting these benefits to people that are actually citizens. And of course, another one is to say, gee, maybe we should reduce the actual level of redistribution to a more sustainable level. Again, to me, saying we're not going to let immigrants because they're on government benefits is one of the most perverse approaches to this. Because the whole idea of the benefits is supposedly humanitarian. We want to help the needy, and then to use that as an excuse to keep out people who are, say, refugees, who are far more needy than anyone that's born in your country. And that is truly morally blind. So anyway, we talk about this quite a bit in the book. But again, I would say the main thing is that moderate welfare states are totally sustainable with open borders, and if you go above moderation, then it's a reason to either say there's going to be some limits on who's eligible, or of course a reason to realize, gee, these benefits are kind of crazy in the first place, let's tone it down.
If I may elaborate on it a little bit, a lot of people say that the problems with immigration are that it puts very big strain on housing, that it raises the prices in housing, and that it's putting a very big strain on healthcare. Both of these are, of course, government-run, or the housing is restricted by the government, and in a lot of European countries, the healthcare system is almost entirely run by the governments. But that's the reality. And probably not going to change very soon and very rapidly. So how would you respond to that? Because the market incentives don't work or don't work that well in these industries. So how do you respond to that?
I guess I would start by just being depressing and saying, you know what else is not likely to respond sooner or change sooner rapidly? Immigration policy. Right? So it's true that housing policy and health policy aren't likely to respond rapidly. Neither is immigration policy. So in a way, you might say it all sort of solves itself by not happening. But that is a cop-out, so I'm not going to say that. Instead, what I'm going to say is, look, if you think that we could get a large increase in immigration, then the idea that you couldn't get big reforms in other areas too that are complementary really just doesn't make a lot of sense. So again, in the case of housing, actually, you have stumbled on the topic of my next graphic novel. So I'm now finishing up chapter 2 of a book called Build, Baby, Build, The Science and Ethics of Housing, where I am going over the social science on housing regulation and showing how it really is true that regulation is strangling what would otherwise be a quite abundant and cheap supply of housing. This is a case where government has messed up a very important market. I mean, strikingly, so during the age when government was messing up the energy market in the late 70s, early 80s. Back then, so even now, petroleum is something like 3% of the average American's budget, 3%, whereas housing is about 10 times that. So when government messes up the housing market, it is about 10 times as bad as when you mess up the market for gasoline. So then this is something that I'm going to be talking about a lot. Even there, I would say that it is nowhere near a deadly argument against immigration. The thing is that when you go and regulate housing, normally what happens is just that the housing happens in more remote locations of the country. So, so in the United States, when the Bay Area goes and strangles housing, this doesn't mean that we can't have new people. It means the new people wind up living in Utah or Arizona or Texas. Right, so as long as there is some flexibility, or like the regulations do not bind equally everywhere, then there's always going to be developers who will just go and put people where they can put them at an affordable level. In the case of housing, that's one where I would say, look, obviously, if government's going to pay for it, it makes sense to have some restrictions on eligibility. And for a country to say, oh, whatever can we do, blame the immigrants. It's like, look, it's not the immigrants' fault that you guys are being so pig-headed about this and saying, look, either we let everyone in and give them free health care, or we don't let people in and at all. It's like, how about you let them in and then say they have to pay for the health care? Let them in and say they have to at least pay something for the health care. Why is that something that is not negotiable? Right? And again, I would say this is more of an excuse to not let immigrants in rather than a serious objection. Because again, obviously, if you really cared about the particular problem, you wouldn't be going and trying to change the population of the country. To say, let's deal with health policy by changing health policy. Let's not go and try to do it to change the demographics of the country. Right. And again, if you just think about the number of people who've ever said, let's go and try to get our birth rate down because otherwise we don't have to care for these people with our healthcare system, that would be a crazy argument. Right. And fortunately, people don't make that one. But when people are disinclined to want people around, then they are likely to gravitate to the story of, wouldn't it just be easier if the people weren't here?
Right. So maybe your next book should be on healthcare, and together with Mr. Weinersmith again.
Yeah, I mean, it is a good one. So And again, it's I mean, like, healthcare is interesting because, as my colleague Robin Hanson says, probably the most fundamental problem with healthcare is that human beings greatly overestimate its efficacy. And we're much more inclined to accredit differences in longevity and quality of life to better medicine rather than better lifestyle. And the evidence for lifestyle is a lot better, right? And it's, of course, a lot more doable. Again, during COVID, I've just been stunned. Well, not really stunned, but on some intellectual level, I'm stunned by how few people have just tried to improve their health habits to reduce the risk. Right? This is a fine opportunity if you're type 2 diabetic to lose a lot of weight and keep it off and say, look, I don't want to die. Now my chance of dying is a lot better, and I can do this. I don't need a vaccine. I don't need to do anything except eat less and exercise more. Right? Like, this is very basic stuff. So I've gotten in shape for COVID. I wasn't that overweight or anything, but I mean, for me, it was more like, I'm just bored. I got what else am I going to do? But still, I would say, healthcare is an issue where there's a lot of depth to it. And then again, there's a lot of regulation. Like, not only does not really relate to the problems that people are talking about, but actually the regulation makes the problems worse. So it's one where you can say very fairly there's some market failure, and then look at the regulation and say the regulation's making the market failure worse, not better, because the market failure theory is really an attempt to justify government doing something or other rather than an actual roadmap for what government should do, unfortunately.
Yeah. I have a question for Mr. Weinersmith to change the speakers a little bit. I hope he hasn't frozen yet in the barn. Yes. So my question is, I really like how you approach economics in your comics. It's always very funny, and I've actually learned some economic concepts from your comics instead of learning them back at university. And there's one comic that always really cracks me up. It's on neoliberal Genghis Khan. If you remember that comic.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So the question.
Oh yeah. He wants to. Go ahead.
You can talk about that comic, which is a favorite of mine. But my question, I guess, is how do you come up with all these scientific topics for your comics? Because you seem to have an understanding of economics, physics, philosophy, everything.
That's a very flattering question. For people who don't know the comic, the joke is there's this famous quote attributed to Genghis Khan. It's something like, what is best in life is to crush your enemies and see them driven before you and clasp their wives and daughters to your bosom, or something like that. And so neoliberal Genghis Khan wants to trade with your enemies and put their wives and daughters into the workforce. And so the question was like, how do I research this? Most of what I consider my job is to kind of sit around reading books all day. Actually, I have a page where I put out my reading list. It's probably about 90% of my activity is reading books. So economics, though, is especially fun because, as far as I know, even now, I don't know that there are any other cartoonists who treat economics as a discipline. Most people in comics, if they talk about anything like economics, it's not really economics, it's finance, and it's not really finance, it's saying something bad about the banking system or something. And so, but of course, economics is just rich with psychological and philosophical insights. And so I kind of felt like I was raiding this, pot of gold. I've drifted from it a bit, to be honest, because I'm mostly researching other topics. So I've had a bit of a chance to get back into it lately. So maybe that'll show up in the comic again.
Okay, thank you. There's a comment here from a friend. He says, "I showed that cartoon to my wife and even got a small smile." So Genghis Khan is good for marital relationships. Yeah. On that note, I have to say I have a friend, and I think he is even present in the webinar. Not sure, who says his fourth kid is thanks to your another book of yours, Mr. Caplan. Of course, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids. So that's a contribution to mankind.
That's outstanding. Yeah. So, like my book, Selfish Reason to Have More Kids, is the only one where I can confidently say it's actually improved the world, because it's a book about personal advice that one person can follow if they're convinced. You don't have to convince a majority in any country to do it. So I have heard, I think, of like well over 100 people that exist because of that book. So, and I did do I already know that I do Twitter surveys just to find out whether something has mattered for anyone. And it's nice because you say selection is not a problem, because if the people that are most likely to respond have been most influenced, then at least I discover that they exist. Right. So if I say anyone out there have an extra kid because of me, and then people say yes, okay, well, those people are genuine. There's probably more that I haven't found, but I'm not trying to estimate the fraction of the population that I've influenced. I'm trying to estimate the total number of people that I've influenced. So, but anyway, hopefully I'll be coming out to Prague sometime, right, Martin? And then maybe I can meet whatever kids I have inspired.
Yeah, we'd be delighted. I have to say, my microeconomics 2 professor, my microeconomics 2 professor now says that he uses SMBC in his Econ 101 course a lot. So you guys have already made inroads. So you should definitely come to Prague and do some events here.
Sounds great.
Have you even been to Prague?
That's great.
I have not. I mean, so before COVID, I was so tired of traveling, and I was doing the minimum that I felt I could get away with, and now pretty much I'll go anywhere. There's almost nowhere on earth I won't go now. So let the word go out. I'm tired of being in my basement. Have slides. We'll travel in real life to go places.
So Mr. Amper has a question, I guess. He's raising his hand.
Yep, loud and clear.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
I've got a question for Professor Caplan. And sorry if you have touched upon that. I had a terrible connection, so maybe you have already debated that. So in that case, stop me immediately. Could you elaborate a bit on the issue of relationship between voting rights and taxation of migrating people? So we've got this golden rule: no taxation without representation. But it seems to me that we have got also a problem of representation without taxation in the EU. The people are working, for instance, in Belgium, they are in Poland or from Slovakia. They are paying taxes in Belgium, but they are not represented there at all. But they are represented in their home countries where they are paying no taxes at all. So this discrepancy between representation and taxation is there, and maybe it has been increasing over time. Is there any easy solution, like to attribute the voting rights to pay taxes or anything like that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I did not discuss it earlier. So in my book, The Myth of Rational Voter, I spent a lot of time going over the data on public opinion and why is it that people have the political beliefs that they have. One of the main lessons there is that there is very little influence of material self-interest on voting. So that generally inclines me whenever someone is complaining about how there's too many rich people who have a say here or whatever, to say that's not the issue. It's like, because people are not voting their material self-interest anyway. However, in this case, it's actually more complicated, because I also find a lot of evidence of what we call group-based voting, where people will allow their group identity to sway their voting, even though there isn't much effect on their personal interests. So this is a case where the fact that someone belongs to an immigrant group probably does actually lead them to be treated worse in countries that are receiving them, and so on. Even there, though, I'd say the main issue is that there are such enormous gains of letting people migrate that I'm always nervous about anything that would make people think about that a second time. So once you already have the right to migrate, that's where I would be strongly inclined to say, let's not rock the boat here and upset the Belgians, and maybe this is going to blow up in our faces, and then they just won't let Eastern Europeans work in Belgium anymore.
I understand. I understand it may be a bit more pressing in the European context when you've got when it's much more, much easier and much more straightforward to work in one EU country and to actually reside in another. So maybe a technical problem, but it doesn't have to be that technical after all, and that's it.
Right. I mean, I would say that a lot of the issue of group identity is that, in general, like when you emphasize your identity, it also makes it stronger. And if the problem is that people are treating you badly because they see you as being very distinct, then not making such a big deal out of it is a good way to reduce the mistreatment. So again, I would say that for migrants all over the EU, the best path forward is not one of getting really angry and saying like you're oppressing us because we should be able to vote in Belgium too, but more along the lines of, like we've been here in Belgium for a long time, we really like it, maybe we should get to participate too. I don't know, what do you think? So I'm also a big fan of Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. So trying to figure out ways of changing people's minds by befriending them and making them feel comfortable rather than being hostile. Being hostile does work sometimes, right? So So again, you might say that the way that Eastern Europe got independence was by being hostile to the Soviet Union, although even there, like it was when people were very angry that you were met with severe repression, and then towards the end, when things were toning down, that's when it was possible to have a very peaceful, or like almost totally peaceful separation. So also just worth considering. Again, probably it also had a lot to do with Gorbachev and the Sinatra Doctrine. You guys all know about the Sinatra Doctrine in Czechia?
Yep.
Is that famous there?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I get it my way. Yeah.
Very much so. Thank you very much, and thanks for having you. It's great. Thank you.
My pleasure.
There's another question in the chat. Are you in another project? So I guess you, Mr. Caplan, talked about your upcoming book. What about Mr. Weinersmith? And I'll add a question to it. Will you do another project together in someday in the future, maybe?
I do have, I have a number of projects, which actually partially answers the second question. I am working on I'm trying to think what I can say right now. I have the main thing I can say. I have a kids book which will maybe be out later this year. It's not the least bit related to science. It's you know there's very famous in the English language. There's an old poem called Beowulf, but I'm trying to do a kids version of it. And so that's my next big project. And then with my wife, we write popular science books together, and the big project I have now is a book about like a realistic treatment of outer space settlements, trying to actually slightly relevant, trying to account for like the economic and social stuff that usually doesn't get proper treatment in these stories. So a little bit of that, but no, I mean, I would love to be able to illustrate another comic. But I told Bryan, we talked about this stuff. I'm literally booked for the next 5 years on projects. So maybe after that we'll reconvene. But for now, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that would be fantastic for me. So the worst thing about Open Borders is that I don't get to work with Zach every day anymore. So when we were writing it, I got to have multiple rounds of daily communication. At least it was fantastic fun for me. Zach might be saying, like, Bryan is so crazy, he's telling me that someone needs to have their glasses look a little different because, so yes, I did have a lot of very particular things, but Zach always had a great attitude about it. Zach is human sunshine, so a wonderful person to work with. This is contrary to my interest to publicize, because then it's just going to make the queue of people to work with Zach even longer. I suppose he might be losing the misanthropic person. I can't work with a happy person. But everyone else would love to work with Zach, so that was wonderful. Yeah. But yes, I do have a plan for quite a few of more of these educational nonfiction graphic novels in the future. And then actually, I'm finally turning a fictional graphic novel that I storyboarded into a finished product with the help of a great young artist in the Philippines. So I'm hoping that'll be done in time to give us a Christmas present for 2021. But so we'll see about that. And then I'm also working on the traditional academic book called Poverty, Who to Blame. And then actually I also started work on a self-help book called My Beautiful Bubble, How to Fix Your Life Without Fixing the World. So all of these are going on at some level. Right now my main one is the new graphic novel on housing. So that's sort of, that's my high priority right now. Right. But again, if you liked Open Borders, I think you will really like this book because, again, I'm taking a lot of research, which you might think of as being dry or boring and academic. And I'm showing that when you think of this research as an input into a great policy opportunity, it's no longer boring. It suddenly becomes something fascinating and pressing and transformative, where you just realize, like, why are we settling for this garbage? Right? Why are we settling for a country where you have to be rich to live in downtown Manhattan or San Francisco when we could just build 5 times as many skyscrapers and make it affordable for almost everybody? So why? Right? And just realizing there's this opportunity right in front of our noses, and we've just been passing it up. And again, very much like an Open Border, I'm going to say, these are big policy reforms that virtually all people should be able to agree on. Right. So, I mean, I'm always looking for policies where I say, look, the reasonable liberal, the reasonable conservative should be able to hold hands and say kumbaya and work together on it. I mean, why is it we're fighting each other so angrily over policy trivia when there are when there are issues that we should be able to achieve a quick consensus and then move forward for a radical improvement of life? Why are we wasting time with arguing about the minimum wage when we could be deregulating housing? It's just the kind of thing, like, on some level I know the answer, which is, well, people want to argue about the stuff other people want to argue about. And also, people hate other people, so they don't want to find something in common with the people they hate. They want to find even more reasons to hate them. But nevertheless, I'm going to try to go and get past that and move forward to something better. So wish me luck. I'll be drawing myself as Don Quixote at some point in this book, I think.
Right. So there's a giant elephant in the room when Mr. Weinersmith says he's overbooked and Mr. Caplan is a professor of economics. Why haven't you, Mr. Caplan, told Mr. Weinersmith to raise his prices?
Great question. I actually did ask him this. Here's the thing about Zach. Zach is an artist. He really doesn't care about money that much. So maybe don't tell his wife. But so like I have thought about just trying to like what if I come up with money last time? Could I jump the queue? And it's not how Zach wants to do business. So. Again, like, I respect that, and of course, a lot of the quality of Zach's works come from this monomania of being an artist. That's where so much of the wonder of it comes from. I mean, let me put it this way: like, I got Zach a pile of money at the beginning of the project, and then when we got the contract, he said, "So Bryan, do I have to give that money back now?" And I'm like, Zach, no, dude. Like, I got you money, you see, and now the money belongs to you, and it may be used to purchase goods and services. But Zach was so into the work that he didn't even bother to check whether the money was his or not. So this is, it's something. So it's highly lovable. Zach is highly lovable. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
Well, do you want to say something more, or maybe comment again on how your wife sees it?
That's a good question. Well, see, I feel like there is this kind of, I don't want to say paradox, but maybe the graph is not linear. There's like, the real problem is I make enough money doing comics that, like, anything that is not my regular comics, I do only for the love of it. Like I said, I'm doing a kid's book based on Beowulf, which means it's like a 500-line long unrhymed poem for children, which means it's almost certainly not going to sell any copies, but I'm really enjoying myself. And my 6-year-old likes it. So that, and like you, so I suspect if the other ends of the business were not doing well, my wife would have a much stronger opinion. But for the moment, I'm doing okay.
Yeah, I suppose I could start emailing Kelly directly, but I'm not going to do that to you. Don't worry.
Yeah, maybe you should negotiate with the wife, Mr. Caplan, and just let her do the convincing.
Look, I don't want to do anything that would put a damper upon Zach's wonderful disposition.
Right. So I've seen two raised hands. I saw Radovan had raised hand. I don't know if that still stands, and Zenon has a raised hand, so either of you can jump in.
Yes. Hello.
Hi.
I hope you didn't discuss this issue tonight before I joined you, but I always had a question: how much the previous experience of immigration influenced American experience and your evaluation of it? My question was like, majority of immigrants last maybe 50 or 70 years came either from Asia or Mexico. And how about, because the discussion in Europe is about the immigrants from Muslim countries.
From Muslim countries, did you say?
Yes.
Right. So of course in the United States, people, most people here are still quite upset about the immigration that we've had over in recent decades. So support for at least more immigration remains a minority view, though it's more popular. So again, my view is that it's been great. Although probably like a common view among Americans is that the immigration that we had from Europe was fine, but since then maybe not. And a lot of what I've said is that the actual evidence is that the immigration has continued to be very good. In terms of immigration from Muslim countries, I have talked about this a bit. So, obviously the main thing that has bothered people about immigration from Muslim countries is the terrorism. I spend quite a bit of time in Open Borders talking about how terrorism is the kind of issue that's very emotionally affecting, but is not very quantitatively important. And to go and base policy upon it, in a way, you could say it lets the terrorists win. It lets the terrorists win if you let the horrible, murderous tableaus that they paint to change the way that you think about other human beings in the world. So again, I'd say terrorism is the kind of problem that you should think about as dealing with normal police investigation, not something that you should be trying to solve with immigration policy or anything else. Or foreign policy, really. So in terms of the integration of Muslims into society, so I'd say that in the U.S. So I teach at one of the highest Muslim population, student population universities in the U.S. And I just look around and I really do wonder what people are complaining about. They're doing fine. In terms of assimilation, it's just notable how much assimilation there really is. What I was saying before is that there's never going to be news stories about someone that grew up in a conservative Muslim home and then became a moderate Muslim or then is now secular. It's not a story. Right? You want to have a story about someone who grew up in a secular home who became a murderous fanatic. That's a story. So if you judge what's going on based upon the news, you are getting an extremely misleading picture, and they are trying to manipulate you and confuse you. And it does take a lot of effort just to say, I'm just not going to allow that to happen. People have sometimes said that I'm like a Martian or like I'm a Vulcan because I don't let this stuff get to me. I'll say I tried. I do have normal human reactions when I hear about a terrorist incident. It's just my next reaction is I'm not going to let this change my mind about anything. It proves diddly squat. So I'm going to stick with the numbers and not just let the fact that it's a gripping story change my mind. So in terms of what's going on in Europe, I'd say Europe does have a bit more severe issue with the welfare state than the U.S. has. I think this has impeded the good kind of assimilation where people realize you show up in a country and you've got to get a job, and you're probably going to get a job with people that don't share your background, and you're going to learn to work with them. So I think that countries where they have a more restrained welfare state are doing a better job with assimilation. And again, if you're not happy with assimilation, then thinking about trying to move towards a more restrictive welfare state where at least there's a time limit or there are work expectations or what have you is a very important move. But again, to go and say we're not going to let immigrants because we have a system that allows people to stay on welfare for their whole lives, again, that is such a strange attitude. And again, one where people start off by saying we have to protect all of our fellow human beings, and you end up saying, and that's why we can't let these refugees into our country. The idea that someone would not have their head explode from the cognitive dissonance. Of course, no one's head explodes ever from cognitive dissonance, but still, it is notable. So I see there's a cool question for Zach in the comments.
Had a question.
Right. Hello. First of all, I would like to thank you both for your work. I've been a fan of SMBC for many years, and it's brought me great joy. And also, Mr. Caplan's work on libertarianism influenced me a lot. My question is, did you gentlemen influence each other somehow in your political views? As I would suspect that Mr. Weinersmith is is not a libertarian, so I was wondering if there was some change of his views during your cooperation. Thank you.
I mean, I would say that one of the main things that Zach taught me in writing the book is that you can make an effort to be sensitive without being without losing the chance to be funny. So there were a number of my original storyboards where Zach said, "Oh, you're like totally needlessly upsetting people here, and we could do it another way, and then it would be good." And I said, "Yeah, you're right."
That's an interesting question. I would say the good friends influence my views. It's mostly on like more narrow issues. I think of myself as libertarian on immigration. Yes.
Well, so I haven't heard much of this. Is your connection okay, Mr. Weinersmith?
Zach, I think Martin needs you to repeat what you just said.
Did I lose my connection? Sorry.
Yeah.
Out for a second on me. Oh, okay.
We can't hear you.
Yeah. Gosh, I can't remember what the question was now. Have I been influenced? Yeah. I live in the country, and there's not a lot of internet out here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Weird. Okay.
Yes.
I'm going out in the snow, y'all. Yes, I think of myself as libertarian on things like immigration and drugs and a couple other issues. I think the extent Bryan's influenced me has mostly been through his writing, his books and stuff. I think on immigration we were pretty simpatico from the beginning. So I would say he's what I like about Bryan's books is even when I think he's wrong about something, he's very clear, so I can think clearly about what I think. That's something that is lacking in a lot of modern discourse. The good faith representation of one's ideas, but a little influence for sure.
Yeah, Zach, there is the one comic strip you did on the signaling model of education, and I never knew whether I had whether you got that independently or whether I had any influence.
No, what was funny? So I think I'm like, so when I read your book on the signaling stuff, for me it was just like reading something I already believed. So my experience with that stuff is I was like an artist, and my wife is an academic scientist, and I was just shocked by how the system actually works. And so I started reading in the area I read, it was called Science of Science Policy, but just the sort of sociology and economics of academia. And it was nice because I'd already come to a lot of similar conclusions, but they're not comfortable conclusions to relate in most of my in-group. So it was nice to read that they're okay to say in somebody else's group. But yeah, I enjoyed it. But no, I don't think you influenced me on that one. I think the horror of witnessing the system was plenty influential.
Yep. Because so if you guys take a look at that particular cartoon by Zach on the signal model of education, it's a very sophisticated version. there are people who have written whole articles criticizing the model without having as sophisticated of a target as what Zach did in the cartoon. So, because you've got conformity signaling built in there too. It's not merely some kind of simple-minded IQ signaling story. So that's what makes it good.
That was nice to hear. Thank you.
Yep.
Well, like I said, you can learn a lot of things in economics from SMBC, maybe more than in university. A question for Mr. Weinersmith in the chat. Your comic SMBC is published daily for many years, and despite my intuitions, it is still extremely funny, fresh, interesting, and exploring new topics. What is your process? How do you get inspiration? Question from Martin.
Yeah, I think I've probably partially answered this, but I can be more specific. So basically, what I do is every day I have to read a certain amount of books, and so I probably average 3 or 4 books that I read a week, and they have to be like non-crappy books. They have to be books that are challenging and difficult, and in topics that are maybe boring. I've come to think one of the major skills in life is being able to read something that's boring, because often something that is very dry to read once you've assimilated it is very fun to think about. And so that's actually come up a ton. I think I mentioned I was doing research on a book about space and like space settlement, and so a lot of that is reading legal texts, which are like a level of boredom I didn't know existed. But once you understand what they say, then the discussions are really interesting. And so what's really valuable for someone like me in reading stuff like that is not just that it's challenging, but also nobody else is willing to put in the pain of reading it. So often, I mean, ideas that seem like that might seem fresh to you are ideas that have been in some field for 100 years. But there aren't a lot of people willing to put in the agony of getting it.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Caplan is signaling to us that he needs to sign off soon. So if there is a last question for him, maybe. I don't see any, so I'll thank you again for writing this wonderful book, and I'll be happy if you could maybe share our crowdfunding campaign, and I hope that we will be able to see you here in Prague for probably not the book launch, which should be in the summer, and there probably will be no offline book launch because I think we'll still be under lockdown, but perhaps next year, and to introduce the book and maybe talk about your other books, other projects, and we'll be delighted to have you here.
Sounds great, Martin, and I hope you're wrong. I want to be there this summer. All right. Okay, so yeah, thanks again, everybody, and really looking forward to seeing the translation go through, and always great seeing Zach. Fantastic seeing everybody. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, love seeing you every time. Talk to you soon.
Okay. All right, see everybody later.
Hang on 1 minute. I actually
thank you.
Oh, we lost Bryan.
Mr. Caplan.
Oh, there you go.
Still here.
I actually remembered I had one question. There's a panel. I'm sure you remember it. This is a very favorite of mine. I think it's on page 77. It's the one where the babies scream at Milton Friedman, and the whole chapter is hilarious. Could you maybe say a few very brief words on it, and I'll let you go.
Right. So one of the most common objections for libertarians is to find this old quote from Milton Friedman about how you can't have open borders in a welfare state, and then email me the quote, and then say, so see how you're wrong. Now, of course, I had heard the quote a number of times, but I put it into the book. There's a few things you can say about it. And of course, one of them is, well, you wouldn't, if there's a welfare state that gave immigrants $1 a year, you wouldn't say that means you can't have open borders. So obviously, it's a matter of crunching the numbers. And that's where I spent a lot of time actually going over the numbers and trying to make these numbers as interesting as possible for readers. So do that. But then there's the discussion of, fine, so if only, if there's only a few categories of immigrants that are a net burden, such as low-skilled elderly immigrants, then why not just say, fine, we let in all the immigrants except the ones that are elderly and low-skilled? And that's where I have this argument with Milton about saying, well, look, I mean, like any argument you can have against immigration, you could also have against the birth of a baby, right? Right? And yet you want to stand up for free reproduction, not for reproduction of everyone that's statistically likely to be net positive for the Treasury, right? All right, and what's the difference? Right. So if you think that this principle of free reproduction is important enough to stand up for and say we're not going to go and start making casual exceptions just because the numbers are a little unfavorable, similarly, I say you should have the same default for immigration and say we're not going to start keeping people out just because there's a small number of them that will be a burden on the Treasury given the current system. So, and then I just got to have fun talking to Milton. I met Milton Friedman once in real life, so it was fun to get to talk to him in fantasy.
So there's a departing words from Tomasz. He had to go to his family. He says, so Zach basically said it's all about pain is gain. Thank you very much for your work, gentlemen. I'm very happy that you do the work you do. I'm afraid I must depart and take care of the many kids that we produced as part of the homework for selfish reasons to have more kids. Bye-bye and thank you. I think Tomasz actually has 5 kids, and I think they're all boys. And so also to Mr. Weinersmith, thank you very much for writing the book, and thank you both for finding the time to talk to us today. We are really grateful that we had this opportunity, and to both of you and to all our viewers, thank you for your participation. Thank you for your attention, and we'll see you again at some future event. Thank you very much.
Talk soon.